Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I am coming at you with my top fiction reads of 2018, and I am super excited for this video because I really loved all of the books on this list, to the point that even trying to rank them from least favorite to most favorite was really quite agonizing. And so, with the caveat that these books could really be in any order, here are my favorite fiction reads from 2018, from most favorite to most favorite. I've also done full reviews for many of these books, so I'll link those down below when appropriate. First up, I have Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, which is an odd little curiosity of a novel about a 36-year-old woman who has been working at the same Tokyo convenience store for the past 18 years. And in many ways, she understands the organism that is the Smile Mart much better than she understands other people. She has very few meaningful interpersonal relationships to speak of, and she has failed to meet the milestones expected of women her age, including marriage and children or an impressive career. Instead, she has thrived in her middling part-time position as a cog in the convenience store machine, and this book looks at what happens when the order and routine of that environment is taken away from her. This is a book about capitalism and gender and conformity in contemporary Japan, and it looks at the ways in which we all construct meaning in our lives and how society deems some meanings more acceptable or valuable than others. And throughout the book, Murata is able to strike a disarming balance between whimsical satire, black comedy, and some much darker themes about the price of conformity in the modern age. It's a book that really caught me by surprise and contains many complicated questions under a veneer of a quirky premise and rather simple prose, and it's a book that I'm still thinking about and really recommend. Next up, I have a true novel by Minae Mizumura, which is an absolute brick of a book at over 800 pages, but it has a special place in my heart because it is the very first book that I read in 2018, much of it while traveling home from the holidays, and it has remained one of the most propulsive and enthralling reading experiences I had all year. This is a contemporary retelling of Wuthering Heights set in post-war Japan, but it's really so much more than that, because while Mizumura borrows her basic narrative framework and character archetypes from Emily Bronte, she situates that beloved Victorian classic within the frame of a distinctly Japanese novel. And in doing so, she is able to challenge and kind of deconstruct the primacy of Western storytelling. The characters in this book are also a departure from the original text, and Mizumura zeroes in on the character of Fumiko, who is the Nellie Dean figure in this book, and on Taro Azuma, who is this novel's Heathcliff, in really fascinating and intriguing ways. This is a deeply nested, many-layered, and at times unwieldy epic that looks at characters who are doomed less by their own personal whims and desires for vengeance, and more at individuals who are caught up in the overwhelming tide of history. So if you are a fan of Wuthering Heights or contemporary Japanese literature, I really recommend this book, and I would urge you to not be put off by the length of this novel because it really is one of the most readable books I read this year. Next up, I have a book that I read just a few weeks ago and which quickly shot to the top of my favorites list, and that is PAVANE for a Dead Princess by Park Min-gyu, which I've talked about on my channel a lot lately. And this is the story of a star-crossed romance between an extremely handsome young man and an extremely ugly young woman who fall in love over the course of a brief winter in 1980s Seoul. And while I loved this book in part because I'm a fan of melancholy love stories, I think the thing that hit me hardest about this one were its reflections on youth and what it's like to be young and to not know anything at all, to have all of the possibilities of life in the palm of your hand, but to not know what to do with them. In many ways, this is a plaintive reflection on how painful and paralyzing youth can be when you're so young that you have no perspective and no hard-won experience and no sense of what you may or may not regret in the future. And while all of the feelings that these characters experience, all of the joy and the agony and the boredom boredom and the apathy of youth will feel quite recognizable and familiar to many readers, the setting in mid-80s Seoul with all of its glittering city lights and deadening urban striving give this book a sharpness and a specificity that makes it seem as if you are experiencing all of those feelings again for the first time. It is an elegant and deeply romantic book that is equal parts love and despair, hope and regret, and I cannot recommend it enough. Then I have My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh, which had one of the best covers and some of the most caustic and biting writing of the year. The narrator of this novel is a beautiful blonde 20-something who is riding a wave of prescription medication in an attempt to sleep away an entire year of her life in pre-9/11 New York. And Moshfegh's writing is like a razor hidden in a piece of candy, as sharp and cutting as it is delightful. But I often find that a vivid narrative voice is compelling only up to a certain point. And what really put this book over the top for me were all of the cracks in our protagonist's cranky facade, because there is real grief and anger and alienation lurking beneath Moshfegh's spiky and often venomous prose, just under the surface of consciousness. And the dynamic between our apathetic, model-esque narrator and her socially striving and desperate best friend Riva is one of the most interesting elements of the book, and a relationship that adds a real gut punch to the end of this novel. Next up, I have Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, which follows several generations of a Korean family living in Japan during and after the Japanese occupation of Korea. And this is a book that considers the meaning of home and family and nation and language and blood ties, and how all of that relates to individual and collective identity. This is a historical epic, a sweeping family saga, and a literary gem whose clean and graceful prose carries you across the years and generations of this story like water. So this book has a narrative flow and rhythm to it that keeps you reading, but despite sometimes skipping several years between individual chapters, nothing about this book feels like it's just skimming over the surface of these characters' lives. Instead, each chapter of this book is a story unto itself, with its own depth and real human drama. I was reading an interview with Min Jin Lee where she said that in order to prepare for writing this book, she spent a lot of time interviewing and talking to Koreans living in Japan, and you can feel the rigor and the research and the care that went into this book on every page. Every character and every moment in this book has its own texture and its own shadings and its own suggestion of a much deeper and broader story. This is an absolutely immersive read that feels dense with human experience and heavy with the weight of history. Then I have Normal People by Sally Rooney, which is the much buzzed about literary romance that follows two students at Trinity College Dublin and their on-again, off-again, will-they, won't-they relationship. And it has all of the keen social perceptions and sharp observations that have quickly made Rooney a literary phenom and a quote-unquote voice of the millennial generation. And it captures with exquisite clarity all of the poses and postures that we all assume in different social settings and different interpersonal relationships. And the romance in this novel in particular is so well observed and captures all of the dizziness of falling in love while also remaining firmly grounded in the real and in the ambiguity and uncertainty and misunderstandings that so often complicate relationships, particularly between young people. I also think that the more I think about this novel, the more I appreciate the way that Rooney explores individual subjectivity and how that functions in a relationship between two people. How connection can be transcendent and transformative without ever fully penetrating our internal and unknowable selves. And she ponders whether human beings are inherently unknowable or whether we're all less mysterious than we may think. And these are questions that can't necessarily be answered, but they're ones that add depth and nuance to what is already an extremely compelling and satisfying contemporary love story. And last, but certainly not least, I have Half a Lifelong Romance by Eileen Chang, which probably comes as no surprise because I feel like I have been talking about this book all year. This novel follows the doomed romance between a young couple falling in love in 1930s Shanghai, and Eileen Chang's prose has all of the rich colors and sharp edges of a perfectly cut gemstone. And like many of her stories, this novel has a certain glamour to it that evokes 20th century cinema, but it also has a dark sense of fateful injustices that recall ancient tragedies as well. Because amid all of the lushness and the romance of her writing, there are always strains of the sinister. Chang is an unforgiving and at times brutal writer who does not spare her characters or her readers from utter devastation, and this is the kind of book that will topple any human heart, because beneath all of the beauty of the characters and the images that she crafts, there is always a cold and quiet rage, a hardness of hearts that have calcified but not entirely collapsed in the face of immense suffering. It is brilliant and devastating. Those are all of my favorite fiction reads of the year. Let me know what some of your favorite books from 2018 were. As always, thanks so much for watching and Happy New Year. Bye!